Welcome, I'm Catherine Hadro, and this is EWTN Pro-Life Weekly. Protecting life amidst the coronavirus pandemic, pro-lifers in Congress ensure pro-life funding protections. The Decadent Society. New York Times columnist Ross Douthat has a new book which explores our declining fertility rate. And World Down Syndrome Day. We celebrate our brothers and sisters who have an extra chromosome. The U.S. Congress created a funding bill to respond to the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, and pro-life lawmakers ensured that bill included pro-life protections. The House of Representatives passed the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. It included Hyde Amendment protections, which ban the use of taxpayer funds for abortions. Pro-life advocates claim these protections will protect the emergency funds from being misused. This coronavirus aid package provides sick pay, free testing, and emergency food aid for families. It follows an initial $8.5 billion in aid that was approved 2 weeks ago to combat the pandemic. To discuss this and more, we're joined now by Autumn Christensen via Skype. She is the policy director of the Susan B. Anthony List. Autumn, welcome. Can you break down for us what was happening with coronavirus budget negotiations that our pro-life viewers should be aware of? There were some headlines claiming abortion language was almost snuck in.
Well, you know, anytime we have a bill that is providing assistance for health care, we at the Susan B. Anthony List take a very, very close look at that legislation, and this legislation was no different. As the legislation moved forward, it was intended and will provide testing for coronavirus and other health assistance, as well as paid sick leave, and to help people who are dealing with this crisis. And what we discovered was that some of the language did not have longstanding protections against funding for abortion, and that had to be corrected.
House Democrats have accused pro-life members of politicizing the coronavirus by including these pro-life protections. What's your response to that?
Well, it's just not a fair characterization. The Hyde Amendment, which prevents taxpayer funding for abortion, has been around for a long, long time. And due to the relentless and diligent work of our members of Congress and pro-life organizations for many decades, well, that has always been the status quo. And this effort was simply to ensure that that same status quo applied to this piece of emergency legislation.
Autumn, as you mentioned, this all centers around the Hyde Amendment, and the Hyde Amendment got some attention at this past week's Democratic debate. Let's take a listen.
Joe, you have in the past, on more than one occasion, voted for the Hyde Amendment, which says that a woman, low-income woman, could not use Medicaid funding for an abortion.
The reason why I affirmatively came out opposed to the Hyde Amendment was that if we're going to have public funding for all health care along the line, there is no way you could allow for there to be a requirement that you have Hyde Amendment. A woman who doesn't have the money could not have coverage under health care.
Autumn, can you clarify for us what is the Hyde Amendment?
Sure. So named after a staunchly pro-life member of Congress, Henry Hyde, this amendment was offered first in the 1970s to prevent taxpayer funding for abortion in Medicaid. And the principle of the Hyde Amendment has been really extended throughout federal programs, with the exception of Obamacare, which of course was a big loss. But what it does is it says, look, we're not going to pay for insurance that covers abortion. We're not going to pay for abortion. That's not the role of the taxpayers, and that's not what most Americans want to be using their hard-earned tax dollars for.
And Vice President Joe Biden had long supported the Hyde Amendment up until recently. Isn't that correct?
That's right. And I think what you're seeing now is just how far the extremism of the Democratic Party has gone. It has become clear that if you want to rise to a position of leadership within the Democratic Party, if you want to be vice president or you want to be president, that those candidates have to throw away their convictions regarding things like funding for abortion and instead accept this extreme view that not only should abortion be widely available, but it should be underwritten by American taxpayers. There are very few pro-life Democrats left. Now, one, Dan Lipinski, is a candidate who, and a member of Congress who we are very enthusiastically supportive of, but increasingly pro-life Democrats are being pushed out of the Democratic Party, and it's very disappointing.
There was another aspect of this coronavirus funding bill I want to get your reaction to, and that's about paid leave. Autumn, why is this important for families right now, especially as schools are closing down across the nation?
Sure. Well, so many parents are now juggling trying to work from home and help their children learn and thrive and give them the attention that they deserve throughout the day. And we only have signs that may become an even longer term situation. So for those parents to have the option of taking some extra time during this unique moment in history to be able to spend that time working with their children who are at home is really important. Not to mention also the many parents and Americans who work in jobs where they can't telework, and now they're facing a loss of income because they work in the service industry, they work in a restaurant, or they work in the tourism industry. So this measure was very important in trying to relieve some of the pretty dramatic impacts that the social distancing and the closure of schools are having on Americans today.
And finally, Autumn, can you explain what was President Trump's role in ensuring the Hyde Amendment protections remained in the coronavirus relief bill?
You know, this is just a perfect example of why it is so important that we have a pro-life president, and President Trump has certainly been the most pro-life president we've seen. So having this pro-life president and also pro-life leadership in the House and the Senate, that's what it takes when you have a negotiation. There's the White House, the Senate, and the House sitting at the table deciding what's in and what's out and what's mandatory, and the threat of a veto pen is what makes all the difference. So we are so grateful to President Trump and his team and Republican leaders in the House and the Senate for ensuring that these important Hyde protections are applied to this bill, and we'll be looking forward to many other probably funding bills coming down the pipeline to address this crisis and making sure time and again that these pro-life protections are kept in any final legislation and are there to ensure that this crisis isn't compounded with another crisis of greater or expanded abortion.
Autumn Christensen, Policy Director of the Susan B. Anthony List. Stay safe, stay healthy, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, and to you.
The House recently passed a relief bill to combat the spread of the coronavirus pandemic. It includes paid sick time, free testing, and it also includes Hyde Amendment protections. Those are pro-life protections that were included by pro-life lawmakers. The Hyde Amendment is a long-standing federal policy that should be in place of the spending bill to make sure none of the emergency funds are misused for abortion. The president has expressed his full support of the bill, and that brings us to this week's call to action. Go to ProLifeWeekly.com to thank President Trump for ensuring Hyde Amendment protections were included in the coronavirus spending bill, and also ask to ensure it will be included in all future health care legislation. Once you get to our website and type in your information, your pro-life message will go straight to the White House. The Hyde Amendment is a vital pro-life policy that should be included in spending bills to make sure emergency funds are not used for abortions. Go to ProLifeWeekly.com to send your thank you message to President Trump. One author claims that when you start to see a declining fertility rate, that is a sign that a once powerful and rich society has stopped advancing. New York Times columnist Ross Douthat explores that in his new book, The Decadent Society. Douthat stopped by our studio last week during his book tour for a conversation about sterility and its impact not just on this generation, but the next one too. Here's our conversation. New York Times columnist Ross Douthat joins us now to discuss his new book, The Decadent Society, How We Became the Victims of Our Own Success. Ross, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
This is a fascinating read, and I want to focus on your chapter about sterility. But first, can you explain what do you mean by a decadent society?
So I'm defining decadence to basically mean stagnation, repetition and sterility at a very high level of wealth and technological development. So the argument in the book is that basically since the late 1960s, I start with the moon landing to sort of pick a peak, right? That not only the US, but Western Europe and even parts of the Pacific Rim have entered into not like catastrophe and decline, but a sort of loss of the sense of possibility, hope for the future, that then manifests itself in slowing economies, gridlocked politics, and to go to where you want to go, collapsing birth rates.
Right, you dedicate chapter 2 to sterility and the declining fertility rates, and you write, quote, amid all of our society's material plenty, one resource is conspicuously scarce. That resource is babies. Ross, can you expand on that and why is this happening?
So nobody's quite sure why it's happening. That's what's interesting. Like, you can tell a very simple story about why birth rates have declined to some extent, right? Obviously, you know, we no longer have agrarian economies where you need large, you know, strong sons to work your farm. Happily, we have lower infant mortality rates, so people don't need to have 7 children to have 3 or 4 survive to adulthood. And, you know, women are able to work outside the home and have a wider range of professions available to them. All of that explains why birth rates have fallen. It doesn't explain why they've fallen to such a level that no rich society except Israel is even close to replacing itself. And that, I think, is more of a mystery. If you, and even now, if you ask people how many kids would you like to have, even in a sort of, you know, a secular society where most people don't have humana vitae up on the shelf, people still say they want between 2 and 3 kids. But if you look at how many kids they're having, our birth rate is at 1.6, 1.7. In places like South Korea, it's at 1. So you're, you know, that has the potential to cut your population in half without immigration over a couple generations.
Ross, what role does secularization play in fertility rates? Because as you noted in your book, Sweden is more secular than Poland, but the Swedes overall have more kids than Poles.
Yeah, it's not a simple story of the most, you know, the most religious societies automatically have the most kids. That being said, you know, if you go country by country, there's a pretty clear correlation that, you know, as your viewers would expect, right? Religious groups, Catholic and Protestant, Orthodox Jews, and so on, have more kids than, well, more conservative religious people have more kids than more liberal religious people, and then the religious have more kids than the secular. So I think my hypothesis is that there is something about the idea that you are embedded in a story, right, that extends beyond yourself and your own moment to, you know, the next chapter, a next development, that makes people more likely to start families. And so it helps to think that your story has a capital A author.
Right, that's well said. And what consequences then do a thinning family tree have on a family down the line?
Well, this is the really interesting question, right? I mean, you can tell a lot of different stories about how it slows economic growth because societies get older and they're, you know, less likely to be dynamic and creative, how it makes political sclerosis more likely, they're more resistant to reform and change. But I'm really interested in the family dynamics. And, you know, even something like, you know, you hear a lot of stories now about how college kids are too sensitive or they're snowflakes, you know, and one thing that's striking as someone who has multiple children is, you know, large families, they toughen kids up in interesting ways, right? Like if you're a 4-year-old in a family with a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old, you can't afford to be too special a snowflake, and you get used to sort of managing interpersonal tensions, you know, if the family is healthy. So I think even there you can see stories of, you know, the thinner your family trees get, the fewer cousins you have. In certain ways, the more, on the one hand, more sensitive you are because you haven't had a sort of toughening up, but also the more isolated you are as you go through the life cycle. And then as you get to old age, you already see this in Japan, right, where, you know, they've had low birth rates for a long time. You have these, you know, really sort of tragic stories of people in their 80s and 90s living sort of almost warehoused in apartment buildings, you know, where they, you know, during a heat wave, people will die and no one comes for them for months. So I think, you know, for people who are in their 20s and 30s and sort of experiencing that phase of life that I've now left behind, the effects of this maybe don't get felt as dramatically as they do as you get older.
That absolutely makes sense. And is this notion of a decadent society a similar idea to the throwaway culture that we hear Pope Francis talk about?
To some extent, yes. I mean, it's a society that doesn't have a strong idea of the future or of the past. So it's sort of lost faith. It thinks that the past was bad and unprogressive and corrupt, but it doesn't have a lot of confidence about the future. So it does, I think, tend toward sort of disposable forms of culture. You don't get people, building the great cathedrals and writing the great operas. I should say, not that I attend opera all the time. I mean, I myself am decadent too, right?
Well, we are so grateful for you being here and for writing this fascinating read, The Decadent Society, How We Became the Victims of Our Own Success. Ross Douthat, thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Coming up, we want to celebrate our brothers and sisters with an extra chromosome. Stay tuned for our story as we celebrate ahead of this weekend's World Down Syndrome Day. Welcome back to EWTN Pro-Life Weekly. I'm Catherine Hadro. In conversations about the coronavirus pandemic, I want to speak up in defense of a vulnerable group for this week's Speak Out segment. As the nation and the world grapple with the coronavirus pandemic, experts have warned the elderly are uniquely vulnerable to the virus. Nations, cities, states, and churches have taken steps to stop the spread of the virus. But some have openly flaunted these guidelines, arguing, well, this virus really only affects and hurts a small portion of the population, the elderly. Not only is this not true, but I want to take this opportunity and caution against dehumanizing language like this. Someone's life is not worth less in older age. Our inherent value does not diminish with each passing year. It is our responsibility as a society to look out for the most vulnerable members of our society, and that includes the elderly. While we should not panic amidst this pandemic, we have Christ's peace. We should be prudent. We should always uphold the dignity of life in the beginning and at the end, especially now. Take steps to protect this vulnerable population. It is truly pro-life. This Saturday marks World Down Syndrome Day, a chance to honor our brothers and sisters with Trisomy 21. An important day because it's estimated nearly 70% of babies who are prenatally diagnosed with Down syndrome in the womb are aborted. That's in the United States alone. So for this week's Pro-Life Focus, we introduce you to a family that looked past the fear of one extra chromosome and saw the beauty of it instead.
I knew something was up in the back of my mind. I knew something was going on, but that's still startling news to receive, no matter how prepared you may be.
When Jason and Erin Thielman, a married couple living in Virginia, found out they were expecting their third baby later in their third decade of life, the pair quickly became experts on some medical statistics. For a woman who conceives a baby at age 25, there's about a 1 in 1,250th of a chance her baby will have Down syndrome. When a woman conceives at age 40, that chance rises to about 1 in 100.
When I was pregnant, because of my age, they strongly encouraged genetic screening. So I said, okay. And I kind of knew something was up in the back of my mind. So we did the prenatal screening. The blood test came back showing a high possibility.
While every baby should be celebrated, that wasn't always the Thielmans' experience inside doctors' offices.
One of the doctors really pushed us towards abortion. I went to a lot of those appointments on my own because third child, we got this, we're good. And especially if my husband was not present, she would use very archaic language. Your child will be a burden on society. He will be mentally retarded. He will likely have to have surgeries, and that will make him even more retarded. Very archaic, hurtful language.
Instead of ever considering an abortion, the two decided to walk forward in faith. The Thielmans are devout Catholics and passionate about the pro-life cause. Jason Thielman is even chief of staff to Senator Steve Daines, chair of the newly formed pro-life caucus in the U.S. Senate. So in September of 2018, Andrew Paul Thielman made a welcome entrance into his home.
Andrew perseveres. He was in the NICU for 30 days. He had surgery for Hirschsprung's disease when he was 15 days old. And I think he was stronger than us at that time.
When Erin was later hospitalized for health issues of her own, the family learned pressure to abort their son with Down syndrome didn't end in the womb.
One of the doctors, he asked how much stress I'd been under, and I was like, well, I had an emergency C-section. The baby has Down syndrome. He had surgery when he was 15 days old. We just got him out of the 30-day stay at the NICU. We've had some stress. He said, didn't you know you had the choice to abort your baby? You could have saved yourself and not been going through this had you had an abortion. And I was laying in my hospital bed, pretty weak, and I just told him, like, get out.
At about 9 months old now, baby Andrew is proving to be a gift to the Thielman family.
He's my pacifier. I mean, that's how I view him when Erin was sick and in the hospital and trying to manage the 3 kids. I just sit and hold him after getting the other 2 to bed or getting him up in the morning or in the middle of the night, and just holding him, I just felt a calm and peace.
He will just hug you right away or kiss you right away.
Big brother and sister Alexander and Abby, ages 8 and 6, are excited to have another sibling at home.
He's nice, and he smiles and laughs. He talks a lot. He's like, wow. And like this. Sometimes when he speaks baby voice, it sounds like he's talking like something else. Yeah, and sometimes like he kind of speaks in adult and like kind of like.
While big brother and sister may not be able to put it into words yet, their love for baby Andrew is obvious.
What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? I am in a baby picture frame.
For the adults in the family, the youngest Thielman has already brought some life lessons to light.
One of my favorite places to hike is Garden of the Gods in my hometown of Colorado Springs. And it's filled with red dirt. And it is so cool, so special, so unique, and so rare that having a child with Down syndrome is like finding that red dirt trail. You know, every child is a different path on the trail of life. But those with Down syndrome, I equate that to finding that really special red trail.
I think it's natural to have a lot of fear and apprehension and be angry. I mean, I had moments, and I know you had moments of just being angry about it, and you have to go through kind of various stages of coming to understand and terms with that. All of that really disappeared when the baby was born, and that really, I mean, it's just so true.
It's almost as if baby Andrew is evangelizing to his family already at 9 months. And when you learn the meaning behind his name, it makes all the more sense.
All of our kids have an A name. We call them the A team, so Alexander, Abby, and Andrew. So we chose Andrew Paul after St. Andrew and St. Paul, the first and last apostles, praying that he would have the intercession of every apostle from Andrew through Paul.
With the intercession of the apostles, baby Andrew Paul Thielman might just evangelize the world. Thank you to the Thielman family for welcoming us into your home and for sharing your heart with us. That does it for this edition of EWTN Pro-Life Weekly. If you have an idea, a question, or a comment, let's connect online. Find us on social media at EWTN Pro-Life. We'd love to hear from you. And you can always send us an email at prolifeweekly@ewtn.com. Until next week, remember, life is a gift. Your life is a gift. God bless.